The first bishop of my diocese was a French missionary named Bishop Grandin, and popular contemporary impressions might describe him in fairly unflattering terms, but the reality is, he was a man who sacrificed a comfortable life as a French cleric to come to the edge of the known world, not to serve European settlers, but an indigenous population of what would eventually become Western Canada. In fact, his dedication and devotion to these people and his concern for their spiritual and temporal welfare was so absolute that he became known by his contemporaries as the Indian bishop. His pastoral territory it's incredibly vast, stretching from the Hudson Bay out east through the far north, all the way to the far west in what is now Canada. As a point of reference, that's something like the entire circumference of the state of Texas and most of its neighboring states. And to traverse this vast, undeveloped frozen wilderness, he primarily used canoes and sled dogs, nearly freezing to death on multiple occasions. Grandin's life was so heroic and so self-sacrificial that he has attained recognition as venerable in the Universal Church, one step away from beatification. After the various treaties were signed between Indigenous tribes and the British Crown, which signed over any rights the native people had to the land that Britain wanted to consolidate, it became obvious to Grandin that this agreement would only secure their extinction. Because, after all, they were a nomadic people who relied on hunting for their sustenance. But hunting herds of large game required the ability to move and follow these great herds across the vast Canadian prairies. But as soon as they were locked into these reserved territories, their ability to follow those herds became impossible, which led to extreme poverty and in some cases starvation. So unless they could learn to farm or participate in the settler economy through like a trade of some kind, Grandin was convinced they basically had no future, so he desperately and urgently campaigned for funding for schools that would help them to learn to adapt to this future emerging Canada. And by all contemporary accounts, he was a champion of the First Nations people and much loved by them. He risked life and limb to serve them and suffered greatly on their behalf. And fast forward to today, and two major Catholic school boards in the archdiocese he founded, in which I live, unanimously voted to remove Grandin's name from any building, school, association, or institution bearing his name. And the city I live in, a city that he was instrumental in establishing as a Catholic mission, is now entertaining a petition to remove his name from any neighborhood or institution bearing his name. So why has his reputation suffered so much, even among Catholics? Because when judged by the moral sensibilities of contemporary society, the Indian residential school system, which he campaigned to help establish, is considered a moral stain on the character of Canada's history. And I want to pause there and ask a question, hopefully an introspective and an honest question that I think we need to ask ourselves. Do we as a society have the moral and intellectual integrity to admit that as a society and a culture, we don't have any objective moral standard through which we can establish any superiority over our ancestors? Consider how often our moral sentiments fluctuate in this modern age. It's just as likely that our descendants will hold us in contempt for our moral certitudes today. How can such an arbitrary approach feed such a confident reproach towards our ancestors? By today's moral sentiments, unhinged from any rational moral philosophy, every boarding school ever would fail to pass the scrutiny of what we consider abuse. Consider that the strap, which was a leather strap you would use to hit children, was considered a perfectly humane form of discipline all the way up into the 80s in the public schools where I live. When I started school, the strap was still being employed in my hometown. Now, that's not to minimize the suffering of Indigenous people through these institutions, but it is to say that it's very easy to construct a narrative of outrage against any institution that predates our temporarily constructed moral sensibilities. But what really drove our perception of this period of history into a hysterical pitch was, if you believe the headlines of every major news outlet who carried the story, and they seemingly all did, the discovery of a mass grave of children at the site of a formal residential school in Kamloops, BC. 3 years ago, the band council there issued a statement that they had discovered the remains of 215 children buried on the school's grounds through the use of ground-penetrating radar, proving that not only were residential schools a mistake, they were in fact the instrument of mass murder or even genocide executed by the Catholic Church, confirming all the worst suspicions that everyone who already hated the Church might might harbor in secret, but can now boast about in polite society. And in the immediate aftermath of that apparently horrifying discovery, the Catholic Church in Canada pledged $30 million as an act of reparation for this unambiguous crime against humanity. And then the Pope himself, at the insistence of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, traveled to Canada to apologize for these atrocities. Simultaneously, over 100 churches were vandalized or burned to the ground in a wave of hatred directed towards Christians that spread across the country. And let's be clear, these acts and gestures were made as a result of the discovery of 215 bodies of apparently murdered children. There had already been a commission to study the evils of residential schools, which had issued reports that had been exhaustively covered in the public eye, for which many apologies and settlements had already been made. The recent escalation of anti-Catholic hatred and contrition from the church came as a result of the news that had erupted out of Kamloops and was carried by every media outlet around the world with a kind of almost morbid elation. Canadian legislators also responded by lowering flags to half-mast at all federal and provincial facilities and immediately pledged over $60 million in funding to search the grounds of various sites for more bodies. Now, some 3 years later, not a single body of a missing child has been exhumed from any of the sites where these radar scans were performed anywhere in the country. And the longer that time goes on, the weaker the claim of the remains of any children gets. Just pause and think about that for a second. Between church tithes and taxpayer dollars, we're probably close to $100 million dedicated to finding the remains of the alleged victims. But we are yet to find a single one. The likely explanation is that there are no remains at the site of the school in Kamloops or elsewhere. The likely explanation is that the church sincerely established schools not for the intent of committing genocide, but to teach Indigenous children what they would need to learn to adapt to a quickly modernizing world. All that was discovered at the Kamloops site was soil disturbances in an area with known archival records of septic fields being dug in that exact spot. But when GP radar surveys discovered soil disturbances, the conclusion that was immediately adopted without question was the Catholic Church must have buried murdered children here. What does that say about everyone who jumped to that conclusion with little to no evidence supporting it? Not to mention those who are still clinging to that narrative today. That would be like getting a survey done on your property before you did some digging or construction or something like that. And when they found anomalies or soil disturbances, they immediately assumed that unidentified missing children had been buried there and charged you as the owner of the home with their murder without ever exhuming the ground to see if there were in fact bodies there. How do you get from the detection of soil disturbances in a septic field to the claim that you found 215 bodies of children? What an incredibly reckless claim to make, and what an incredibly reckless story for our media to report without any shred of investigative scrutiny. And has anyone apologized in the midst of all of this? So far, just the church has, as far as I know. Because regardless of the evidence available, it would seem that most people, especially our elites, would rather believe that the church is evil than the more evident opposite conclusion. And possibly even worse, for some reason, the church's leaders would rather not challenge that perception for fear that it might mean that they have to actually stand their ground for once. And now there is a bill before Parliament that would amend our criminal code, making it a criminal offense to downplay the Indian residential school system as an act of willful hatred against Indigenous people. The word downplay means to reduce the fullness of measure of something. But how can it be possible to reduce the measure of something when we have no idea what that measurement is? We have no standard of measurement that we're drawing from. In other words, there has to be some established truth beyond any reasonable doubt that one might be able to downplay. But events from history are never so black and white, especially when you're trying to extract some kind of moral evaluation from them, especially in a world that has no objective moral standard to draw from. So basically, if this law passes, it will just be a weapon to use against anyone who says something about residential schools that people with political power don't like. To make claims like Bishop Grandin was a heroic figure of Canadian history and probably deserving of canonization is something that I, as a Catholic, talking about my own Catholic faith and my own Catholic heritage, could probably be charged for in the future. To ask questions like, why haven't any bodies been exhumed at the site where it was factually claimed that the remains of 215 children were found, could be a criminal offense in the near future, a claim that prompted the Pope to apologize in person, the allocation of an incomprehensible fortune of Catholic and taxpayer money, hundreds of churches vandalized, and the shame of Canadians and Catholics worldwide. I honestly wish we could talk about abuses that took place. I wish people who suffered could tell their stories and have those stories acknowledged with composure and sympathy. I wish the church could wrestle with her actual mistakes and even crimes if they existed and learn from them rather than giving every concession to a sensationalist story and thereby avoiding her actual faults. Instead, I would argue that we've further victimized the victims by turning their experience into this extravagant legendary tale about genocide. Like, imagine if you suffered abuse by someone in your neighborhood and you wanted someone to recognize that. You went and told your story to someone, but for political purposes and media sensationalism, some absurd legend was constructed about a religious cult kidnapping and eating children in your neighborhood. That kind of hysterical narrative does nothing to restore justice to victims. It only creates a frenzy of indignation and outrage that refuses to appreciate the real victims who have real stories to tell. In fact, requiring the narrative to become so unrestrained implies that you wouldn't care about the victims unless they were able to fabricate such an elaborate, unbelievable mythology out of their experiences. In closing, I'll leave you with a portrait of the infamous Kamloops residential school, the same school where 215 children's bodies were supposedly found, but never actually found. This comes from a website called IndianResidentialSchoolRecords.com, which I highly recommend people spend some time just clicking around to get associated with this history. In one section, you can search through records of class reunions. At the class reunion of the Kamloops Residential School, you can read about the two-day event held in 1977 for over 280 former staff and students who traveled from all over the province to attend, with some apparent enthusiasm. These are the same people that polite Canadian society insists are survivors of cultural genocide. The event included Indian dancing with Ernie Phillips, slides of the, quote, good old days presented by Father Noonan, where many of the students would recognize themselves, more slides presented by former Indigenous teacher Benny Paul, bone games, and a salmon barbecue and dance. The guest book of this reunion was signed by over 280 people, with the inscription in the preface that says, "This simple booklet will contain the names of people who chose to come together out of sentiment to meet with each other, to reminisce, and to mark the near end of an institution which represents a significant historical era in the lives of Native Indian people." Now, if residential schools, and especially this now infamous Kamloops residential school, were really the machinery of genocide everyone has come to believe they are, why would anyone ever come back to the place of their ordeal to reminisce about the good old days? Can you imagine survivors of Nazi death camps returning to those sites to throw a reunion, to watch slideshows of their time there and to have a barbecue together? Or maybe residential schools were boarding schools where some bad things along with some good things happened. Like most of what characterizes a very complicated era of history that is too remote from our own experience to be able to make the kind of moral judgments that we insist on making for some reason. An era in which people like Venerable Bishop Grandin had to navigate and to try to make the best out of what was often desperate situations and circumstances, motivated by an obvious and deep affection for the people he was advocating for, a people who, again, by all historical accounts, deeply loved him back. To insist that his legacy chart a course of infamy is to further victimize those people and to refuse to hear their actual stories and their own record of history that they might want us to know, instead insisting on a black legend that appeases our perverse sense of incoherent postmodern outrage. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year, and if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support, or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.ca. secwepemc.com.